Hi, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1 on Saturdays and Sundays. Also, you'll find Wichita Liberty TV at my website. That's the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. You'll find this episode, show notes for this episode, all the old episodes of Wichita Liberty TV, and lots of other content that I and others produce on nearly a daily basis. So, there you have it, the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. Today in the studio, we've got co-host Carl Peter John and our special guest, Joseph Ashby. Many of you remember Joseph from his other appearances here on Wichita Liberty TV, but also for his pioneering role in conservative grassroots political radio talk on KQAM radio for a number of years. So Joseph, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate you inviting me.
So we've got an election next week in Kansas. August 7th is the primary election. Both Republicans and Democrats will be choosing candidates to advance on to the general election in November. One of the election that's pretty hotly contested is the Secretary of State race in Kansas. There are 5 Republicans. Chris Kobach is the incumbent, and that kind of brings up an interesting thing. You know, you think Secretary of State, they just keep track of the business records, the uniform commercial filings, the elections, and so forth. And that has been the role of Secretary of State until Bill Graves kind of picked it up a notch and used it as a springboard to Kansas governorship. Then there was Ron Thornburg after that, who ran but was kind of crushed by Sam Brownback. And now Chris Kobach, of course, the current secretary, is, of course, a leading candidate for governor. So what do you think? Any thoughts about Secretary of State office and the candidates? Anybody?
It is interesting how it is these statewide elections, whether it be insurance commissioner or Secretary of State, that aren't really policy positions, that don't tell you a lot about how someone would govern a state. I mean, there's certain administrative qualities that you develop, and you show you can do it or you can't do it, but it's really a wild card. I mean, that's one of the concerns I had in the early going about Chris Kobach, is like, well, he's never really had a policy position, you know, outside of city council. And so it's interesting that it's a springboard to the governorship that doesn't really have almost any of the makings of what the governor does outside of administration.
Yeah. Carl?
Well, my thoughts about the Secretary of State's office are tied to the fact that not only do they get to pick the chief election officer in the larger counties, like Sedgwick and Johnson,
So
and
that's
several
Tabitha
others.
Lehman, who we had on about 4 weeks
Tabitha
ago.
Lehman here in Sedgwick County. But they also have to oversee all the county clerks who are in the roughly 100 other Kansas counties that serve as the election officers in those jurisdictions. And the role that the Secretary of State has is underappreciated, and it's really hard for candidates running for statewide office. I think of the Treasurer, Insurance Commissioner, Secretary of State, in terms of the 3 that don't get a lot of attention. And it's very hard for them to raise money and to draw attention, but they're incredibly important.
Well, they don't raise money because it's boring administrative stuff. You know what I mean, right? We all want our votes counted, but we all kind of assume that's going to happen. It's not until you get into other offices where you really can say, yes, this business will get $10 million, or they won't have to pay these taxes, or whatever. That's when you start attracting a lot of fundraising.
But Chris Kobach really has upped the profile of the Secretary of State with his focus on voter integrity and things like that. Just a couple observations I had. One candidate is Dennis Taylor, who's been the Secretary of Administration and a lot of other jobs in Topeka. The Wichita Eagle endorsed him for whatever that's worth, but one of the things he wants to do is to audit past elections, in the sense that every election you would choose a sample of voters and ask them to prove their citizenship. Now, having to prove citizenship at the time of registration is controversial enough, and right now a federal judge says you can't do that. But can you imagine after voting you get a letter from the Secretary of State that says, your papers, please? And the Wichita Eagle is opposed to those policies of Chris Kobach that favor that. Why would they endorse this guy? Also, another candidate, and I think the one that I prefer, is Keith Esau, simply because he is an IT guy, has been for a long time, and that I think is valuable experience. But also, he appreciates the benefits of ranked choice voting. and actually held some hearings on it last fall. It would take us the rest of this episode to explain what ranked choice voting is. And then when we talk about the Secretary of State being a springboard to higher office, the one candidate I think that might apply to, and I'm kind of hesitant to say this because in American politics, it's kind of uncouth to say that I'm interested in the future in running for a higher office, isn't it? But I think that applies to Scott Schwab.
Yeah, I think he would. That's his ambition. Yeah,
So why can't they just come out and say it? I mean, what's wrong?
Well, that's what I think about. It worries me a little. As a conservative who really wants other conservatives to win, I think Scott Schwab waffles on a lot of issues that I don't want somebody waffling on. So I kind of don't want to see his career advance in that way because I don't want to have a fight all over again when he's running for governor in 8 years or however long it would be.
And he has waffled, I think, on some important issues, especially relating to energy in Kansas. Well, Carl, we were at the Wichita Pachyderm Club a few weeks ago when all 5 candidates spoke, and I was impressed with all of them. I don't know if we can really make a bad choice in this of those 5. Do you think? Or?
Well, I had concerns about Mr. Taylor because, and I'm not a fan of ranked choice voting, just to be blunt about it.
Okay.
But there were some other good people up there. But you always want a candidate who will implement the policy positions that he took in the campaign, and that's always a concern too. But as taken as a whole, they're a pretty good bunch. But I'm always skeptical of whoever our newspaper endorses.
Yeah, that's a good thing, John Whitmer. Let's take a moment out for a commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks here with Carl Peter John, our guest Joseph Ashby. We had a kind of a chuckle as we left for break last time about the Wichita Eagle endorsements. Our friend John Whitmer, who's been a guest on this show and is quite the conservative, was endorsed by the Wichita Eagle. So, Joseph, you said, who's he running against?
Yeah.
Satan?
Who possibly would they choose John Whitmer over? That's the only person I could think of.
Well, anyway, Joseph, probably the biggest race, I'm sure by far, is the race for governor. There's a number of candidates on the Democratic side and 5 or so candidates on the Republican side, 2 which have seemed to pull away from the field, and it's been that way for quite a bit. And that would be our current governor, Dr. Jeff Collier, and Secretary of State Chris Kobach. Both have been in that chair for this show. You can find him there. Also, Dr. Jim Barnett, who has been in that chair too, and the Wichita Eagle endorsed. And you had a video, Joseph, you put on Facebook that you made a decision there. So tell us about that and what are your reasons?
Well, I sort of looked out at the issues of the state. What are the, because different candidates are suited for different times, right? Winston Churchill very famously was ushered out of the Conservative Party in England when World War II ended, but in the lead up to World War II, it's like, no, he is definitely our man. And although I feel bad for him being ushered out, it is true that some people are suited for other times. And as I look out at what the state will face, and I was pretty blunt about it, I think the way our Supreme Court controls the majority of our appropriations process,
the school finance,
through school finance litigation decisions, the deferral of the elected branches to them over the last, really a very long time, multiple governors, that if we don't put a lid on that, you're talking $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion. I mean, just an explosion that would require California level taxes for the state of Kansas if we don't have a governor and a legislature, but in particular a governor who stands up and says, we can't be controlled by the courts in this way.
So some conservatives have criticized Governor Collier because he seems kind of proud that he oversaw a compromise where the court said we spend some more, the legislature spent some more, and at least for now, the litigation seems to be at least at a pause, isn't it? Might fire
correct
up
me, but
again.
the last I heard was not, right? That the Supreme Court is like, this is still insufficient, was the last decision that I heard.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that really goes to the problem, right? You can spend another $500 million, $500 billion, and then 3 months later the court is saying, it's still not enough. So what is it? Is it 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 billion? How much more do you need to spend? And at what point do you say, I'm sorry, the people get to choose their representatives, and if they think they're spending enough, they send people to make those votes, and you can't put it in the hands of an unelected judicial
And
body.
so you feel that Chris Kobach would be the most effective at shepherding the legislature and standing up to the rule of the court over this spending?
He'd be the most likely, yeah.
How will he avoid getting in the trap that Governor Brownback was in, where he vetoes the bill and then the bipartisan majority, the moderates, or rhinos as some would refer to them, and the Republican side join with the Democrats and they override the governor's veto, and that's what happened in the past, and I could see it happening under Governor Kobach.
I can see that too, right? I mean, that takes the power out of the hands of the governor as far as what becomes law, what budgets become law, and he might not be able to stop that. But if you look at his history, he is an aggressive persuader, right? He will go out and he'll say, this is why it's right. And that sort of, we all campaign at election time, but the smart politicians continue to persuade during legislative sessions and during their time in office. And he does that, which is why he got attacked almost as much as Brownback for different reasons leading up to the 2014 election, and still won by 18 points. Why? Because he said, well, I think we should have voter ID, and I think only citizens should vote. And people are like, yeah, that's a pretty good idea. Whereas Brownback was much more passive in the criticism that he received, which gave license to many legislators to say, I'm not going to stand by this guy. I'm going to vote to override this veto, which they might, as far as what Kobach could control, it might give them pause to say, you know what, this guy makes a good case. My constituents are behind him, so I better not vote to override this veto.
Let me ask you, as critics of the Kansas Supreme Court, and I've considered myself one of them, have pointed out that the U.S. Constitution, which oversees the state constitution, has a provision in Article 4, Section 4, saying that each state is guaranteed a Republican form of government. Mm-hmm. With our current domination of state finances by the Kansas Supreme Court, do you think we're still a republic under that definition, or have we become a judicial oligarchy?
Joseph, I'm going to ask you to hold on your answer till we come back from this commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. Carl had just asked our guest, Joseph Ashby, a very important question about, do we have a Republican form of government in Kansas, or do we have a judicial oligarchy?
Well, of course, we mean small R Republican, right, where you elect representatives.
Because we have Republicans all over office, right? Big R Republicans.
Yeah, big R Republican doesn't necessarily guarantee small R Republican. And so the question is do our representatives have the actual power, or is it a judicial body like the state Supreme Court? From a legal standpoint, I mean, it would be very difficult to bring a case, because theoretically you could sue the state Supreme Court in federal court. You would almost certainly lose. But from just the principle, the observation that we could make, if the majority of your state budget is not under the control of your elected representatives, then you're only partially a small R Republican form of government. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe we got to decide our seatbelt laws, but if you are forced to spend an extra $1 billion on whatever it is, and everybody feels a lot of sympathy for schools, we want them to have the resources they need. And so that's one of the reasons why the court gets away with it. But whatever they're telling you have to spend your money on does take away power from the people, absolutely.
Mm. And it's all those words suitable in the Kansas Constitution, and a lot of people say that guarantees children a suitable education. Well, far from it. It says the state must make suitable arrangements for the financing. In other words, it's concerned about spending, not really results. Right. Now, the court has used some concern about results of our education, but is there much, up in Olathe, a huge chunk, and Olathe is the second largest school district in Kansas, a lot of the extra money they're getting goes to increase teacher salaries, and in Wichita, that's probably going to happen too. The lion's share of the extra money they're getting is going to increase teacher salaries, and I'm wondering just how is that going to help the school children?
Well, theoretically, you retain good teachers, but at the same time, because it's a union setup, you also give pay raises to potentially terrible teachers.
Exactly.
So I think it maintains the status quo and puts more money in it. And so you get a little bit of the good, but then a lot of the bad.
Yeah.
Well, we're looking at a situation here in Wichita where the Wichita Public Schools are going to get $43 million in additional state funding, and that translates to between the exact enrollment figures around 50,000. So that's
It's gonna be like $800 a student or
$850 to
something.
$900 per pupil next year.
And that's on top of some $13,000
I
that
laugh
they
'cause
already spend.
We homeschool our children, right? We have 5 kids, 4 of them are school-aged, and we homeschool them. And I posted kind of the rundown that we spend about $300 per child on curriculum, buying
Curriculum,
school books and the rest. And
Supplies.
yeah, and I talked about, if we paid our mortgage, right? Because you got to have a place to have school. I was like, if we paid our mortgage, and if my wife drew a salary, if we added all of it up, it would still be only about $10,000 per student.
Yeah.
And so it boggles my mind that you come up between $13,000 and $14,000 on average per student in the state of Kansas.
$10,000 per student or $10,000 for the entire household?
That's per student. Right, but that's paying the mortgage. That's my wife drawing a salary.
Okay.
It's also paying our utility bills. Basically, we would have our entire lives completely covered just for the responsibility of educating our 4 and eventually our 5 children.
Get nasty here. 1 or 3 meals a day.
That's 3.
Well, Joseph, let me ask you, Ken Seltzer seems to be a perfectly qualified candidate for governor. Why has he failed to gain much traction, do you think?
Every politician has to get over the hurdle of the public seeing them in office, right? I've run for office myself a couple of times. The first time I was a extremely youthful-looking 28-year-old, which 28 is experienced enough to serve in the Kansas House, I think. That's the age that Paul Ryan was first elected to the U.S. Congress and so on. But I clean-shaven at 28. If I would have told people, "Oh, I'm just starting my senior year of college," they'd be like, "Yeah, that about makes sense." And so it was hard for people to picture me compared to my opponents as in that realm. And I think Ken Seltzer has that problem because you see Governor Collier, he's obviously current governor,
yeah.
so people see him in that office. You see Chris Kobach, who has been one of the most
An outsized personality, definitely.
well, major newsmaker for many years, and then his involvement with the Trump transition and so forth, where he got even more attention. And I think ever since Brownback's re-election in 2014, he's sort of been considered the heir apparent, because of his personality, because of what a good candidate he is, and so forth. So you have 2 people who look the part, who are different enough that people aren't searching for somebody else. Mm-hmm. And if you're not searching for somebody else, you usually don't find somebody like Ken Seltzer.
And Senator Dr. Jim Barnett, I think perhaps conservatives, the biggest problem they probably have with him is not that he's a very charming fellow, he is, and I think his wife is very well qualified to serve in office too, but his major issue says we've got to pass Medicaid expansion in Kansas, and that, as we've seen in states that have done that, it turns out to cost a heck of a lot more than anybody ever thought, and the studies show that patients on Medicaid really don't get very good care either.
Yeah, the largest peer-reviewed study on Medicaid expansion was done in Oregon before Obamacare.
They were able to do a random selection assignment.
So it was a huge sample size. It was one of the only, it's a very hard thing to do a scientific study on. But they found a slight improvement in mental health, but no improvement whatsoever in physical health.
And you know what they also found? They found that those patients went to the emergency room more than they did before. And we're told that we need to spend more money on Medicaid and stuff so people won't go to the emergency room as primary care.
Yeah.
Go figure. Anyway, we're going to take our last break. When we come back, we're going to shift our attention, I think, to some local races. Welcome back to our last segment of Wichita Liberty TV. Today, Bob Weeks, your host, Carl Peter John, your other host, and Joseph Ashby, your guest for today. So Joseph, probably one of the races that's generating a lot of attention right here in Sedgwick County is Sedgwick County Commission District 4. There are 2 Democratic candidates running, but there's also 2 Republicans running. One is the incumbent, Richard Ranzoff, who was guest here on this show last week. His opponent is a gentleman named Hugh Nix, who I tried to get on the show last week, but it didn't happen. You were motivated to shoot a short video about this. Tell us what you said in that video, Joseph.
Basically, I addressed, I couldn't do all of them just because of the length of the video, but some of the criticism that has come Commissioner Ranzoff's way, which, you know, it's so divorced from reality. They'll take a vote in the middle of the process, such as the construction of the Law Enforcement Training Center. They'll say, well, he voted against that, so he voted against law enforcement.
Or he asked a question about it.
Right.
A skeptical question.
And
that's
so
what we want
that he
people to
doesn't
do.
support law enforcement. And so if you look at it, and Carl can appreciate this because basically it's the same playbook that they used in his race 2 years ago, which is to say, he'll vote no on some things, and the media portrays him as a intransigent, won't do good things even when they're in front of him. And so we're going to play on that, attack him on those without giving context, and people say, oh yeah, he's bad. He doesn't have good judgment.
I think in your video you said he votes no on stupid stuff. I think
Yes.
that might be the exact phrase that you used.
So I said, so I went through several examples, and I went through dollar amounts that were saved because of, he helped save because of his skepticism, and because of pushing for different bids or compromise on what construction was necessary versus not necessary. And I said, in essence, that he votes no on dumb stuff, tries to fix it, and if it gets fixed, then he'll vote yes.
Yeah.
Which is exactly the kind of thing that you would want a lawmaker to do, or in this case, a county commissioner.
Yeah, Carl, you served on the Sedgwick County Commission, overlapping with Richard Ranzoff for quite a few years. And one of the criticisms they make of Richard is that he's sometimes gruff from the bench, and maybe I don't know exactly what they mean by that. But Carl, you've worked with some pretty intransigent civil servants. I'm thinking of the former county manager, Bill Buchanan. Tell about the importance of the number 3 to him.
Well, the importance of the number 3 for the county manager or any senior staff, with 5 commissioners, 3 votes on the commission determine county policy in almost every case, except for a charter resolution, which rarely occurs, but most of the time the magic number at the courthouse is 3 in front of the commission, just
And
like
3
at
to
City
even
Hall it's
keep
4.
his job, right?
And 3 to keep his, for the managers, yes. I mean, the joke, like basketball coaches, government managers depart the way they arrived, fired with enthusiasm. And so it's very important to have good communication, to have clarity. I think one of the worst things that can happen is to have private conversations that naturally occur, and then basically have people come out and you don't understand where people are at, and there are some unexpected surprises. And I think it's important to clear the air in these public issues for any public office holder, Bob. If you can't articulate the issue in front of you and say it like it is, and I think Richard does an outstanding job of providing, you may agree or disagree with Commissioner Ranzoff's opinion, but no one is ever confused where he's going to come down.
And I think if the worst we can say about Commissioner Ranzoff is sometimes he's a little gruff or crabby or whatever it is, that's nothing to get upset about. I think his opponent, he really talks about, well, we've got to present a unified front out there. We can't be seen to have dissent and everything. But Richard Ranzoff says,
I find that goal totally spurious. Why?
Yeah.
Well, what if you're uniting around a wasteful spending project. I don't want
Exactly.
unity on that. I want someone there to say, hey, this is a bad idea. We shouldn't spend the people's money in this way, even if it ruffles feathers.
And we
And
need
you
transparency in the process.
Yeah, and you said earlier you used the word "they want," and so I was going to ask you who that "they" is, and I think we know. It's the Wichita Chamber of Commerce. Their political action committee, as of Monday, I believe was the cutoff, they had spent almost $40,000 on political candidates. For example, they gave $2,000 to the governor, $500 each to a bunch of area representatives, but they spent $31,000 on Hugh Nix, and most of that was negative spending on Richard Ranzau. That's 78.8% spent on one candidate. Carl, you suffered that onslaught, didn't
Well,
you?
that happened in 2008 too, and despite that fact, I managed to get elected, albeit by a fairly only 55% of the vote.
And we are out of time, but I mean, I've got a lot of material at the Voice for Liberty that shows that, you know, James Chung, the analyst, when he comes to Wichita and says, what we're doing has not been working, it's the Chamber of Commerce he's talking about, and some elected officials, like, well, a lot of them, almost all that we have. Anyway, Joseph, thanks very much for stopping by today. I wish we had more time. Carl, thanks for your insight today. I'm Bob Weeks for the Voice for Liberty, and we hope to see you again next week.